teaching a course in a Sunday school class when I first moved to Corvallis, and coming across a verse in James chapter 5 about anointing for healing. And I couldn't understand what that meant. So I spent the next 20 years reading every book I could on the subject to try to understand what James meant. And I think I came to the conclusion, but it just shows you that some difficult portions in Scripture take a long time to accomplish a basic knowledge of. Well, let me go to my script, and I'm going to cover a broad area today, but I hope that you'll get something out of it, and then in your discussion groups, I hope you'll answer some very pointed questions. The intersection of medicine and religion is as old as human history. It's found in every human culture, ancient and modern. In today's secular culture, many Christian values are widely regarded as an anachronism that is incompatible with modern biomedicine. But these values nevertheless played many of the same roles today as they did in times past. Most often in the context of personal relations, often between healthcare providers and their patients. Today I would like to take you back in human history some 2,000 years to describe how the elements of professional Western medicine developed about 2,500 years ago in order to understand how traditional medical care took shape and how Christianity came to play a supporting role in healing before it gave way in modern times to cultural challenges that in the last century have attempted to divorce Christianity from medicine. In so doing, those challenges have unintentionally transformed the healing process into something that our ancestors, even a century ago, would hardly have recognized. In every human culture, societies have attempted to explain the reasons for suffering in general and for sickness in particular. We term these attempts theodicies, or explanations that try to explain why bad things happen to good people. In the ancient world, the most common explanation for suffering was that the misfortune, that is the illness, was retributive. It was a punishment for something that a person who suffered had done wrong. When the gods were angry, they sent plague, drought, famine, flood, defeat in battle, or some other calamity which could only be removed by sacrifice or by rites that would satisfy the gods or the spirits by appearing or by appeasing their anger. Homer's Iliad presents a very well-known case of this. The Iliad, which I'm sure many of you have read in freshman year of college. The epic begins by describing a plague that has afflicted the Greek forces that are besieging Troy. The Greeks attribute the calamity to Apollo, who has for 9 days been aiming pestilence-carrying arrows at his victims. You can see that in this painting, with the result that piles of corpses are being burnt. On the 10th day, a seer is consulted to determine why the god, that is Apollo, is angry. Once he discovers the cause, Apollo is propitiated, that is, his anger is appeased, and the plague ends. That's a very famous example of what we would call a theodicy, explaining why bad things like disease appear. Throughout antiquity, devastating natural disasters such as plague stimulated not only popular religious fervor, but also the tendency to look for scapegoats. And thus in the Roman Empire, natural disasters provoked persecution of early Christians on the ground that toleration of these so-called atheists, that is the early Christians, had provoked the wrath of the gods. Seems to be almost universally held, or at least it was in the ancient world, that the sick suffered deservedly because their disease was punishment for their sin or some wrongdoing. It might be surprising to learn that the sick were not always viewed compassionately in the ancient world, but often as the recipient of deserved punishment. And one finds this attitude throughout the ancient Near East in a number of places, but also in the Old Testament. One doesn't pity the sick, but encourages the afflicted person to repent. And this is an attitude found in the Bible, in the book of Job and elsewhere. If you've read Job lately, you remember that one person, Bildad the Shuhite, comes to Job to offer his condolences, but in fact he encourages Job to repent. He warns Job that God doesn't act unjustly in bringing suffering on him, that Job and his sons must have sinned against God. If Job repents and begins to practice upright behavior, God will remove the punishments, and God will even prosper him. Bildad's attitude transcends, I think, all cultural boundaries, and one finds it everywhere in the ancient world, in all societies. So deeply rooted was this cultural prejudice that it hindered the establishment of any charitable work on behalf of the sick. Like so much Western culture, professional medicine began with the Greeks. Greek religion was polytheistic. It worshipped many gods, and there was room in the pantheon for as many as you wanted to introduce. It focused on personal faith and on public rituals of each city-state. The city-state, as a unit, worshipped a particular god. What we call paganism, that is the official religion of the ancient world, had no belief system, no dogma that was required. Your belief was a matter of your own choice. You could be an atheist, but provided you went through the public rituals, nobody paid any attention. Now, with so many gods and people moving around a lot, syncretism was common, and new gods from other cultures were easily assimilated into Greek deities. Egyptian gods, once they were recognized by Greeks who came to Egypt to settle, made connections between traditional Greek gods that they'd worshipped at home and those in Egypt. And they simply were incorporated into the pantheon. In the Homeric pantheon, that is in the Iliad, the Greeks believed that gods were active in all areas of life, and that included the sending of disease and sickness. Attitudes alongside of this doctrine of retribution existed as well. Naturalistic healing, through what we would call empirics. That is, people who were untrained, except maybe by an apprenticeship. They were called demiurgoi. They were members of a medical craft, and they relied on their accumulated experience. That was what denoted an empiric, and they usually dealt with wounds and minor illnesses, as this magnificent painting from early Greece shows. In the 5th century BC, Greek medicine developed from a craft, that is of the demiurgos, into a profession. And in that sense, medicine became both rational and empirical. In place of traditional methods of healing, mostly based on a diagnosis of symptoms, medical practice came to be explicitly based on medical theory. The theory wasn't created by physicians, it was created by Greek philosophers, the pre-Socratics. They formulated it, and it was taken over by Greek physicians everywhere. That introduction of theory to practice marks the beginning of Greek professionalism in medicine. One sees this in what we call the Hippocratic corpus, about 70 books that were attributed in antiquity to Hippocrates, thought to be the founder of Greek medicine. Some were written by physicians, some were written by laymen, some were written by philosophers, and in those 70 you find all kinds of different attitudes to ancient medicine. One theory that would become extremely popular in the ancient world, and in fact long-lasting, was the theory of humors. A theory that there were 4 humors. This is, by the way, Hippocrates, a bust of Hippocrates. How much of what we know about him is hard to say because so much of it is anecdotal. And most scholars think that we can know very little about the real person. Nonetheless, he was regarded as the founder of ancient medicine. One theory that was to become widely held in medicine was the theory of the 4 humors. Greek medical practice, though based on rational ideas and in fact developed into a theory, also practiced a certain kind of medical ethics. And in fact, the ethics that many of you practice, or at least are told are still worthwhile, are from Hippocratic physicians. That is, from some of the Hippocratic treatises that deal specifically with ethics. And the most famous, of course, is the Hippocratic Oath. Did any of you swear that? At graduation? Oh, you did. Which university?
No, we do it in Egypt, like in Egypt, go out for
All right.
graduation
Okay, yes. Good. Well, that comes back and goes away in medical schools, but it's the most famous of all the commitments to an ethical practice, and it wasn't apparently sworn as an oath in the ancient world, except maybe by a small group of Greek physicians, but it became a kind of ideal statement of the good physician. Well, religious healing played a part in ancient medicine, but it was in Greek temples and it was almost completely dissociated with the practice of medicine practiced by physicians, that is, those within the Hippocratic tradition. They neither swore the oath nor maintained any easily checked kind of practice because there was no licensure in the ancient world. Anybody could set up his or her shop, usually practiced out of your own home. Sometimes you wandered from city to city, and you might agree that the Hippocratic Oath was a good idea if it was known. It wasn't actually known in print until the 1st century AD. That's the earliest it's quoted by a person within the Greek medical tradition. In any event, Greek medicine developed quickly in the 5th century, and practice was spread to the Romans. In the 3rd century BC, the Romans had only a tradition of what we might call magical folk medicine, not very sophisticated. And when the Greeks began to come into contact with the Romans, Greek physicians were in demand, and so they began to go throughout the Mediterranean world, including to Rome, and eventually dozens, then hundreds, and finally thousands of Greek physicians settled in the Roman West. And, interestingly enough, they used the humoral theory. The humoral theory that had been created by Empedocles in the 6th century BC and became a part of Greek medicine, and it lasted long beyond the period of the ancient world, accepted by nearly all physicians in the ancient world. It spread throughout the Middle Ages and probably was widely used at least through the 16th and maybe the 17th century. It was one that was devised by Galen, who was a physician in the 2nd century AD, and was still widely used. His writings were widely used as late as the late 18th, even the 19th centuries. Well, let me talk now with that background about early Christians and their views of medicine. Early Christians presented a new idea of human nature. It's the biblical view, the Christian view, and it included a number of things, including the place of suffering in the human condition. Christians believed that suffering was intended by God. It had come into the world early in human history, and it was used by God to promote a variety of good purposes. Now, that meant that the application of the human view of suffering would change the nature of Greek medicine, and it did, because the traditional view in Hippocratic medicine, it was spread through the Roman world, was that the sick person did not deserve compassion, which was not a widely held value in Roman society, but that human suffering was something that one had to deal with often on one's own. There was no religious background for charity. There was nothing that we would call private charity, in fact, in the ancient world. And by charity, I mean compassionate response to human suffering. Greco-Roman approaches were largely philosophical, insofar as they talked with the nature of how to treat the sick. And it was definitely the case that compassion was not regarded as the ground for treatment. Instead, it was given the background of Stoic ideas especially one of apatheia, which was a kind of insensitivity to pain, and it was often practiced in the Roman spirit of quietism. And by quietism I mean the idea that human nature cannot be changed. The world is as we find it, and there's not much we can do about it. Well, the idea of making progress in medicine, the idea of helping those who are suffering because largely of the misfortunes that they experience on account of sins they'd committed, didn't give any rise to a place for medical charity. And that had broad implications which are even difficult to understand. There were no hospitals in the ancient world. Why not? Well, I think partly the cultural preconditions meant that people didn't see the need for building hospitals to take care of people. And even during times of plague, it's surprising the insensitivity which the classical world showed. Poussin's famous painting here shows a plague that hit the city of Ashdod in Syria, but in fact there were many plagues in the ancient world, and especially in the Roman Empire. A major one in the 150s AD, another in the 250s AD, and we have a number of descriptions of what the conditions were, the cultural and social conditions during that plague. One was written by Dionysius, who was the patriarch of Alexandria during the period of the plague of Cyprian, as we call it. This is what Dionysius writes. The heathen behaved in the very opposite way from those of Christians. At first onset of the disease, they pushed the sufferers away, and they even fled from their dearest ones, that is, members of their own family, throwing them into the roads before they were dead, and treating unburied corpses as dirt, hoping thereby to avert the spread and contagion of the fatal disease, but do what they might, they found it difficult to escape the disease. Very famous description in which we're told that in Carthage about 5,000 people died every day. The same in Rome, and a similar mortality rate in Alexandria. What should they do? Well, Cyprian, who was the bishop of Carthage at the time, wrote a famous letter in which he urged Christians, even during a time of persecution, to take care of the sick, which they did. And the sick were treated mercifully by Christians who, in spite of the fact that they faced persecution, Cyprian himself was put to death a few years later, they went out into the streets and they buried the dead. In fact, the practice of burial was one that every Christian church from first century on expected. That is, there was no public provision, and so there were corps of burial assistants who did that work, and they now began to approach the people lying in the streets and gave burial to them. What did the Christians think of the disease? Well, they didn't believe that it was punishment from God, and they believed that it could often be used as a means of examining ourselves. We tend to be more introspective when we're lying flat in bed, sick with an illness, than we're enjoying a good life. And so they regarded as sickness, illness, mortality, plague, as things sent by God not to punish us, but to focus our attentions on helping others and also on our own spiritual conditions. This view, however, that was held by nearly all pagans in the ancient world, and by many people today, is that it was a punishment. And that theodicy, which we first saw in the oldest one ever written from Mesopotamia, about the 2nd millennium BC, that view is widely held today. And I just give you one example. Very famous historian, Tony Chelt, who was also a public intellectual, he died of ALS in 2010. And he wrote a piece in which he said regarding the diagnosis of his fatal ATL, to fall prey to a motor neuron disease is surely to have offended the gods at some point, and there's nothing more to be said. That's not an ancient view. It's a modern view, and of a very famous intellectual just a few years ago. And some of you, as medical practitioners, have heard your patients ask, Why is God punishing me? Maybe you've even asked yourself sometimes. It's a common experience even of Christian believers when they find themselves struck down, but it is not, and I believe should not be, a Christian response. And I've just listed very briefly here 4 Christian fathers who gave passages that relate to this. I've just taken a sentence or two out of their writings, and I'll just read them. You can read them yourself. These deserve a whole lecture in themselves. Augustine viewed illness as a relative blessing that could both be used and disused. No early Christians considered, and I'm quoting here, I'm offering commentary, no early Christians considered good health to be of absolute value. Secondly, Jerome urged Christians to rejoice both in health and sickness. You can probably remember some biblical passages that urge us to do that. Our spirits are perfected through the weakness of the flesh, and illness prompts people often to readjust their priorities. Maybe it has done that for you. Thirdly, Basil, the founder of the first hospital, believed that sickness is sometimes a chastisement for sin or is intended to prevent us from being prideful. Chastisement is God's discipline, not a punishment, but a way in which God speaks very specially to us. And finally, Gregory of Nazianzen held that illness was sent as a purification for sin, not a judgment, but a purification, as a test of virtue, and to provide examples, like Job, of patient endurance. Well, let me move on now to charity, what I would call medical philanthropy. Our English word philanthropy comes from the Greek philanthropia, and it means, if you know any Greek, you know that it means the love of humanity. Philos, philia, love of human beings. Now, when Greek physicians or writers on philosophy were talking about why anyone should be motivated to practice medicine, philanthropia was one virtue that might serve you to do that, but it was a minor virtue. And Galen, the most distinguished physician of the 2nd century, perhaps of all antiquity, discussed in one of his treatises several motives that might propel people to practice medicine. He calls them possible incentives. They include philanthropy. It's down the list, but also desire for money, desire for honor, and immunities from taxation. History certainly hasn't changed in that regard, has it? Should you practice as a physician philanthropy? Galen said no. Like the other incentives, you might practice one or the other. Physicians are motivated by different reasons, but only medical competence was essential to the practice of medicine. And I think Galen is enunciating a point of view that was widely held in the ancient world. Well, Greek and Roman philanthropy rejected compassion as a motive with a few exceptions for medical treatment. And in doing so, they differed a good deal from Christian views of why people should practice medicine, both in motive and practice. In fact, the larger cultural values of Greece and Rome militated against medical philanthropy. That was because of their view that the world couldn't be changed, that is, a quietism, and the apatheia, the insensitivity to suffering that allowed so much cruelty to be practiced in the ancient world. Just have to mention gladiatorial combat, for example. Now, does that mean that no ancient doctors ever practiced philanthropic medicine? I don't think you could say that. I think that a number of them surely did. But it wasn't something that was any more than personal. Because there existed no virtue of compassion which would have any necessary effect upon physicians. There is one writer, Scribonius Largus, in the 1st century, who was the first person to mention the Hippocratic Oath, by the way, who does mention that compassion is a good value and that every physician should have it. So Christianity introduced a very different set of values to undergird medicine than the values that dominated the classical world. And over time, those values of Christians began to undergird the ethics of medicine. Basic to Christian ethics in practicing medicine was the compassionate desire to meet physical needs and to help those in need. Whereas Greco-Roman philanthropy, or I should say values, recognized no religious basis for charity that involved actually a personal concern for helping those who required help. Christianity based its views on the Greek word agape. If you've read anything about that concept, it's divine love. Love for the loveless. It's one of 4 Greek words for love, and it had virtually no definitive meaning in ancient Greek. But it was adopted by early Christians, and they used it to describe God's love for the world, and especially the redemptive love that sent Jesus Christ to the cross to die for our sins. And of Jesus' teachings on compassion, there was nothing that was more important than the story of the Good Samaritan. A brief parable told only by one gospel, and it served as a definite goal of Christians, especially of Christian physicians, that they would care for the sick. And in fact, it became a motive because it reflected the divine love of Jesus. And Jesus gave that parable in answer to the question, who is my neighbor? And that was the Good Samaritan. And Jesus' response was, go and do likewise. A simple sentence that tells people that the Good Samaritan should be reflected in the values of all Christians. So in early Christianity, compassion became an inspiration for ordinary Christians to practice in the realm of the care of the sick. And how do you do this? Well, the early church, already in the first century, decided that every Christian should show the love of God by visiting the sick and the poor. But very early, churches also developed a congregational form of organized assistance. Each congregation, each ecclesia, as it was called in Greek, maintained a clergy of priests and deacons, and they cooperated in the direction of the church's ministry of mercy. Care of the sick and the poor was especially delegated to the deacons. This fresco shows St. Lawrence, one of the 7 deacons of Rome, distributing alms to the poor. Once a week, in Sunday worship, alms were collected. They were under the supervision of the priest, who then made arrangements for the deacons to distribute those to the poor in and around the church. And there was another group of people who were very active in visiting the sick and poor, and those were women, mostly widows, and the office of deaconess grew up among them in the early church in the 2nd century already. We read of deaconesses in the churches. But after Constantine in 313 recognized Christianity as a legal religion, not as the only state religion, but as a legal religion, it became possible for the church to heighten a good deal its medical philanthropy. But even under persecution, which existed quite strongly at various times in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, this kind of medical charity was practiced. I've mentioned the case of Carthage, but also in Alexandria and elsewhere. So that in the first 2 centuries of the Christian era, after the time of Christ, the Christian church became the only organization in the Roman world that systematically cared for its sick. And that seems surprising to us, but it's because we have such a long tradition of that. Now, the perception that the early church had to care for the poor was basic to the founding of the earliest hospitals. The hospital was, in its conception and its practical founding, a specifically Christian institution. It was rooted in Christian concepts of charity and philanthropy. There were no pre-Christian medical institutions in the ancient world. The closest thing we have was what was called the Valetudinarium. It wasn't a hospital in our sense because it wasn't a charitable institution. It was maintained by 2 groups of people, by Roman legions for soldiers. This is the one from Xanten, which I've seen. It's been restored very nicely by the German government. And it was a very large one, but it was only for soldiers. And large slave owners also built a valetudinarium for their sick slaves. But they were not charitable, and they didn't offer very much medical care. But they were a kind of precursor to the real hospitals that were founded first by Christians. And we have a fairly good history of this. The first hospital was founded by St. Basil, who had become a bishop, founded monasteries, not only with a great Christian heart, but an active doer, as bishops often were. He began with a leprosarium during a widespread plague of leprosy, and in 369 he began to build one, and by 372 he had finished it, and it was no longer limited to lepers. In fact, it offered all kinds of care. We know quite a bit about it. We have some sources, but we also have some early depictions. This is not contemporary, but it is a 10th century depiction of the Basileus. That was the House of Basil, was what it means. It had reception rooms and places to care for 6 groups of people: the poor, the homeless, and strangers, anyone who needed a place to stay, orphans and foundlings, lepers, the aged and infirm, and the sick generally. Now, it was small at the beginning, but it gradually grew. And it became a model for all subsequent hospitals. Just to give you an idea of what we're talking about, I'm showing you a map of the expansion of Christianity. That should be BC, not CE, BC 31 to AD 300. The hospital at Caesarea, the Basileus, was situated in the town of Caesarea in Central Asia Minor. There's still a city there, Kayseri, in Turkey, from the ancient city. And the hospital spread very rapidly to the Eastern Empire, and there came to be dozens, and over the centuries, hundreds of hospitals that were found. And they came to be regarded by the Romans as a particularly Christian institution, because there weren't any other kind around. Now, they were by our standards very, very small and limited. Probably most of them didn't have over 25 or 35 beds. In large cities, there would be several. For example, in Constantinople and in Alexandria, there were a number of them. And the earliest hospitals were an outgrowth, in one sense, of the monastic movement. As you probably all know, what we call Cenobitic monasticism was founded by Pachomius, the second generation after Anthony, and he pioneered the first infirmary for monks alone. And at least one author has argued that that was maybe the origin of a number of early hospitals. So the early hospitals, small, sometimes pretty barren, formed a pattern of taking care of all who needed it. And from the beginning, they were intended to be the indigent who were poor. That's what Basil founded his hospitals for, to take care of the poor sick. If you were a person who could afford it, you invited a doctor into your home. It's still the case into the 20th century in many places, wasn't it? And it was assumed that you got better care at home than you would in a hospital. But Christians have always been the greatest founders of hospitals. If you were to write a history of the hospital, you would find that most of the hospitals in America until the 20th century were founded by religious and most of them Christian institutions. Now, Basil's idea was especially to take care of the lepers. And there was a special reason for this. Lepers were regarded as being, what shall we say, loathsome and also contagious. You didn't get near a leper. You didn't touch him. You didn't touch his clothes. You burnt his clothes because they might communicate disease. Actually, however, one Christian father, Gregory of Nazianzus, considered leprosy a sacred disease because he said, although it had a natural cause, he didn't attribute this to any kind of punishment by God or to a supernatural demonic force. He attributed it to God, and he had the reason. He read medical literature, and he found that it was black bile on the humoral system that was regarded as the cause of leprosy. But what Gregory did was to assume that there was also a religious meaning, and that to have leprosy communicated a sense of holiness. Like Christ, the leper was rejected from society, untouchable. People were hostile to him. And yet, he bore the image of God, the Imago Dei, created in the image of his Creator, and because he was a leper, didn't detract from that. And the Cappadocian Fathers, as we call the three famous fathers in Asia Minor in the 3rd century, they developed an interesting metaphor. They said lepers bring a certain sense of holiness to their caregivers. And the reason is that they shouldn't be stigmatized because God has sent the leprosy. It communicates a certain holiness to them. And that connection with their caregivers, Christians who take care of them, communicates the leper's sense of holiness to the caregiver's sinfulness. How are caregivers sinful? Well, the metaphor is interesting. We live for material goods. The leper is forced to live for spiritual values. Who is spiritually deficient? Gregory said it's we. We, the healthy, whole-bodied human beings. We let our sins make us concerned about materialism, about building up a community of goods, a life of good seeking. And the leper is spiritually superior, and therefore the relationship between the person who cares for him and the leper produces a kind of triadic relationship, which of course includes God. Interesting, isn't it? Well, following the creation of the Basileus in 372, hospitals spread quickly. It's interesting how many inventions human beings never think of until one person thinks of them, and then suddenly the idea spreads. And that was true of hospitals. Most of the best hospitals were in the East, in the Greek East. The Western world was declining very rapidly, and the resources simply weren't there. But monasticism also hadn't made as strong an imprint on the West until actually the 5th century. In the Western Empire, however, the first hospital in Rome was founded by a woman. Her name was Fabiola. She was a deaconess, and she was a very wealthy woman. She was a friend of St. Jerome's, who translated the Bible into Latin. And she worked by herself, but eventually surrounded herself with a community of assistants. And she would go out to the highways and pools and various public places and treat the sick. And eventually she, with her own money, created a hospital and began to bring them into her hospital. She cared for the poor with her own hands, and that was something that pagans couldn't understand. Pagans admired the work that Christians did in creating hospitals and being institution builders. But the idea that Fabiola had of going out and actually treating people who were sick, poor, and lying in the gutter and managing to bring them back to a hospital for real treatment, that was Christian love, and it couldn't be understood by most pagans. And there's a cultural factor here that I think you have to understand in order to understand the Christian hospital. There was, in the ancient world, for those who had no home, no place to die. If you were a homeless person lying on the streets, there were no hospitals to take care of you. Most doctors wouldn't go searching for people to take care of in the gutter. And you could go to the temple of Asclepius in Rome, but that was difficult because there were two classes of people that couldn't go to the temples of the gods. One were the dying, and the second were women about to give birth. So we have cases in Greek literature of men who were about to die, and they would have to be removed from the temple and die outside on the street because they would pollute the sacred precinct. The same way, if you were about to deliver a child, you would be ushered out pretty quickly because that too would bring a sense of what was called pollution. Now, it's possible that the god or goddess might heal miraculously. Here you find a plaque showing Asclepius healing in two ways. One in the natural way, because he was the patron god of doctors, but the second is incubation, healing in a temple by the god who appears to him in a dream. But for the ill, there was no place to go. And that's what initially the hospitals, that of Basel and others, were designed for, a place to die. And that was the first time in history that we know of that, and it was something that continued almost down until the present, with the idea that if you had the resources, you would live and die in your own home. The doctor would see you there, but in a hospital, you took care of the indigent. And there are many famous cases of hospitals being founded for that person. Just to show you one example, here is one founded by Samson about 530 in Constantinople. He had healed the Emperor Justinian, and so Justinian accepted his request that he build a hospital. And it became the largest free clinic in the Byzantine Empire for about 600 years. And, of course, grew from its original tiny size. And all this was done to represent Christ the healer. Christus Medicus was the Latin name. Christ the physician. Although in its understanding, that phrase usually denoted Christ as the physician of the soul. Is our soul sick? Of course it is. Sick with sin. Christ, our Redeemer, will heal our sin, but he will also go on to heal the body, as he did. And so in medieval hospitals, and this is one of my favorite illustrations of one, and there were a number of medieval hospitals, the poor were taken care of, but often in these hospitals they were relatively poor, and the monks didn't have a lot of money. They were the caretakers, and so they would try their best to offer what today we would call palliative care. But they were also extremely sympathetic. Compassion is the ground of Christian philanthropic care. And Peregrine Horton, in an article, discusses this necessity in the ancient medieval worlds within a Christian community of offering care for the soul, as Christ did. The passions of the soul, that is our struggle with sin and redemption and living a Christian life, were something that they dealt with in medical writings sometimes, as priests who were sometimes physicians were encouraged to deal spiritually with the needs of their patient and not just physically, and to encourage cheerfulness. Basil thought that was a very important quality. How did you do that? By singing psalms. If you sing psalms, you find David and other writers reflecting all of life, death and dying, but also promoting cheer for those who need it. Now, today we would call probably this a positive outlook, but it was that and more than that, a real interest in Basil and his followers in producing the right kind of a mental attitude. I'll mention just briefly that in the Middle Ages, following the fall of the Roman Empire in about 500 AD, the economy was very poor, and literacy virtually disappeared outside of monasteries. Only in monasteries were the monks able to read or write. They were literate. By that I mean they could read and write Latin, and physicians who were sometimes trained in medicine and medical care in monasteries would practice what was called learned medicine. And learned medicine was medicine reading the classics of medicine. And here you see a scriptorium of a Benedictine abbey in which monks are reading and copying not just biblical works, but works in the Galenic tradition. Many of Galen's treatises were translated into Latin so they could be read in the Middle Ages. And they were. And this brings me to beneficence. I'm sure many of you recognize this. Some of you probably attended worship services in here. This is the Hanging Church in Coptic Cairo, founded in the 3rd century AD, and a center of Coptic worship for hundreds of years. Hospitals weren't the only kind of medical philanthropy in the ancient world. There was another kind that was perhaps practiced in many cases before hospitals were created, and that is charitable lay orders of men and women who came to do the same sort of things that Fabiola had done. That is, take medical care in the name of Christ to people in the slums. And they were organized in many of the churches throughout the Roman Empire, in all the big cities, including Alexandria, but also many smaller cities as well. Some were ascetics who'd taken vows of celibacy and poverty, but others were people who were nobles, noble women and men who'd given up their titles, their property, sold it, and spent their life in doing charitable work. The ancient world was filled with large cities, magnificent buildings, but also lots of slums. Because there was nothing in the Roman psyche that encouraged people to help the poor. The poor were as they are. There's no chance that they're likely to get better. Their poverty is their own fault, and even much of their sicknesses as well. So there were in the large cities many people in the slums. There was no provision for shelter of any kind, nobody who invited them in, no rescue missions, no hospitals, and perhaps the only place that you could find some kind of warmth, especially in winter, was in the public pools. And there was usually a public pool in every city, I should say, in the Roman world. And that's the reason why often you find, for example, healings in the New Testament, in Acts or in the Gospels, around a particular pool, like the Pool of Siloam, because there would be people with physical disability. That's where they gathered. But there were also people who were generally repelled all the time. The disabled, especially lepers and those with mental conditions. This is a nice depiction from the Middle Ages, from the 14th century. 2 lepers are coming into a city, both clearly disfigured. And they have a bell, a noisemaker. They always carried that to warn people that they had leprosy. And they're not given any welcome in this city, are they? They're turned away. And that's the case in many, many places. So they had an especially difficult situation, and the Christians recognized that. And so a significant purpose of the spudaioi and the philoponoi was to help people of that sort. Especially at night, they would go out, search the streets, take people sometimes to hospitals, but sometimes they would treat them on the streets, giving them distributions of money, repairing their wounds, and the like. We don't hear about these very much. They didn't call attention to themselves, but we do have a few descriptions of them in Antioch, in Alexandria, and a few of the larger cities. And they had all the poor that they could handle because the public government, municipal authorities, made no attempt to do anything. This is a very famous painting from the end of the 18th century showing a large public pool that even in the period just, a couple of hundred years ago, was used as a gathering place for those who were sick. What were Christian physicians like? Did it make a difference if you became a Christian in the ancient world, that is, in the period of the 4th or 5th centuries? And I think the answer is yes. That would have to come after 313. That's when Christianity became a legal religion for the first time. And Christian physicians began to think about how they would practice medicine in a Christian way, as almost all of you who plan to become physicians or are physicians already thought. Am I a physician who merely happens to be a Christian? Or am I a Christian first and a caregiver second? And if that's the case, the latter, then how do I use my Christian commitment to bring to my vocational calling? Well, Christian physicians began to develop. I've done a study of this, and it wasn't really until the period after 313 that you begin to find mention of physicians. And we have a few rather interesting ones. Origen wrote in the 4th century that Jesus provided, and I'm quoting, the model of a philanthropic physician who seeks out the sick so that he may bring relief to them and strengthen them. Well, that's fair enough. Lots of non-Christians would say that. But he goes on to say that the Christian physician manifests a Christ-like compassion in his care for commoners, for the poor, and the destitute. That was always regarded as one feature of Christian physicians. And even the model of Hippocrates was for a number of early Christian writers a kind of model. Jesus, the Good Shepherd, the great physician, and Hippocrates, who would become an iconic model of an ideal physician. This is the earliest representation we have of Augustine. He had a friend who was a doctor, Gennadius. He describes him as a man of devout mind, kind and generous heart, and untiring compassion as shown by his care for the poor. It's interesting that in the 4th century already, Christians began to be known as lovers of the destitute, philoptokoi, those who loved the poor. No other philosophy or religion in the ancient world could have had that particular distinction. It was a title that wasn't claimed by pagans because it didn't belong in their value system. To be a lover of the poor meant that you identified with the poor. To be a doctor who treated the poor meant that you had something particular in being a Christian. And we have several examples in the 4th and 5th centuries. One was Hypatius. He was a monk in the 5th century and early 6th centuries, and according to his biographer, he treated patients that were afflicted by various kinds of diseases that caused other physicians not to treat him. What was that? Was it leprosy or some hideous disease? Probably so. St. Basil said that Eustathius, a friend of his who was a doctor, was a physician who combined a spiritual ministry with a ministry of physical healing. That was the pattern. A doctor should give not only medical advice, but also spiritual advice. He became intimately aware that his patient might have a spiritual concern, maybe even one that weighed down on the disease. And that became the model for a number of Christians who became doctors of the soul and doctors of the body. And here again, Jesus became the metaphor. Some of you probably have seen this in Capernaum. It's the fresco of a church that shows Jesus healing a man on a bed, but it's a model of his being the healer of spiritual diseases. Christian medical charity was unique in the ancient world. There was nothing like it. It represented something that hadn't been in existence in the Greek and Roman world for 1,000 years, maybe I could say even 1,500 years. And it was fostered in the closely knit community of the early church. And the church consisted of a body not only to worship God through Christ, but also to have a practical outreach in the local community. And that outreach was motivated by agape love, by the love of the unlovely, the love that reflected Jesus' love for us on the cross. And the Christian perspective on health and disease reflected this mission of doing what Christ did. That's its major departure from the pagan view. And the value that Christians accorded to suffering gave suffering a positive value for the first time in history. A positive value, not a negative one. Those who were sick had no responsibility for the most part for their sins. Of course, Christians recognized, as pagan philosophers did, that we bring on our own disease. In some cases, too much of certain drugs, too much of a careless way of life can bring on disease. That was widely known. Christians talked about it already in the 5th century BC. But people lying in the streets didn't need to have tongues or fingers wagged at them. They needed to be helped. And that's what Christians did. Why? Because they bore the image of Christ, the Imago Dei. Was the image of Christ to be found only in perfect, healthy human beings? If you look at Greek statuary, you see that all women are beautiful and all men are physically fit. Those were like the gods, and they thought they were like the gods in emulating this fine physique, a healthy mind in a healthy body. But that wasn't the Christian view. The Imago Dei said, Christ created us all in his image, the leper as well as the healthy person. And if they're suffering, it's because Christ has called us to a ministry of helping them. And this was the motive of the sustenance that was given in the early church to people who waited on the sick. And when I say this, I mean something that is easier to understand if you know the ancient church in the ancient world. St. Paul and the missionaries who followed him for hundreds of years went outside Jerusalem to preach the gospel and founded churches. They went to the big cities. From the very beginning, the church was an urban institution. And the cities were a good place for a church to be founded because, as I've indicated, for the rich, life was good. For the large number of poor or displaced people, it was often very, very difficult. And those people were in cities with no support system. There was no welfare system in the ancient world. And Stoicism, though it had many good doctrines, had no place for those who didn't share its values. And that included those who were sick. There's a kind of steel attitude in ancient Stoicism, as attractive as it is superficial. The Stoics had a low threshold for anybody who showed suffering. Well, I'm quoting here from a little book that influenced me a lot when I was in college. It's by a man named E.R. Dodds, Pagan and Christian in an Age of Anxiety. He talks about the church as an urban institution. He says that cities were a lonely place for many people, and I'm quoting here. Such loneliness must have been felt by millions. The urbanized tribesman, the peasant come into town in search of work, the demobilized soldier, the worker ruined by inflation, and the manumitted slave. For people in that situation, and there were a lot of them in the ancient world, especially in the 4th and 5th centuries, with drought, failure of crops, many people poured into the large cities, especially in places like Asia Minor. Some of them couldn't find a place to live, so they slept on the streets. There was one human institution that welcomed them, and that was the church, the ecclesia. And that's why one writer could describe early Christianity in the churches in the cities as a miniature welfare state in an empire which for the most part lacked social services. A mini welfare system. I think that describes it quite nicely. And I'm showing you a picture of the earliest church that we know of. As you probably know, the earliest churches were house churches, actually for a period of about 2 centuries. The first separate detachable buildings were built in probably the first third of the 3rd century. And I visited the oldest one that we know of, and that's in Dura Europos, in Syria, on a cliff overlooking the Euphrates River. And it's badly damaged, but it was discovered, I think, in the 1920s. And if you look at the plan, you can see that it had a courtyard, an assembly room for worship, a teaching area, and then a baptistry. Every church had a separate baptistry, separate from the sanctuary. Well, it was a large city, lots of human traffic coming and going, and lots of people who needed help. And that's why the Christians devoted their charitable activities to the poor. They reached beyond their own walls to people who needed help, especially in times of plague. but also in burial and in a number of other ways. So the church was a center of compassionate, charitable activity. It was modified only gradually over time. At first, every person in the church was asked to visit the sick. That's clear in the epistles of St. Paul and others. Then it was enlarged by the employment of people like deacons or grave buriers who formed a separate craft to bury those who needed burial because nobody else would do it, or to visit the sick poor. And you find many examples of this. And St. Basil finally, in 372, constructed the first hospital in the history of mankind. And the idea spread rapidly, and Fabiola in Rome constructed the first hospital there. And most of the caregivers were monks or nuns in those hospitals. And I'll close by quoting from what E.R. Dodds, who wasn't a Christian, by the way, confesses at the beginning of his fascinating book that he was an agnostic and bears no special love for either agnosticism or Christians. And that allows him to write fairly dispassionately. He says, and this repeats what I've already mentioned, that neither pagan temples nor religions created a caring community similar to that found in the Christian church. What's the reason? Because they lacked a theological basis for care. Do Christians just like to punish themselves, doing works of charity? Do they do it to keep the flesh under control or to fill retirement years? No. There's a theological basis for it, and that's found in the theology of Christ who gave himself for us. Love of others, according to Dodds, wasn't a singular human idea, but he says Christians practiced it more effectively than any other group. And the local assembly, the local church, provided the essentials for social security. As we would define it, it cared for widows and orphans, the old, the unemployed, the disabled. It provided a burial fund for those in and outside the church who needed burial. And it also provided a nursing service in time of plague. But, says Dodds, even more important than these material benefits was the sense of belonging and being cared for which the Christian community could give. Dodds suggests that it was in the Christians' creation of that caring community, both for its own people and for those outside, that was, and I'm quoting here, a major cause, perhaps the strongest single cause, of the spread of Christianity. So God included that in the charge he gave to the church. And I think the church has never lost sight of that charge which Christ himself established. Caring for those in need, wherever you find it. You don't have to travel very far to see people in physical need, or economic need, or spiritual need. But caring for the poor who needed attention and who suffered from physical affliction struck the Christians from a very early stage. And I believe that it was in the development and extension of that role, as Dodd says, that Christianity's chief contribution to healthcare developed. Thank you very much.